Welcome to time period 5. We are going to pick up with chapter 10. Chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13 actually all go together. And so what this chapter is looking at would be the causes of the American Civil War, the war itself, and then the Reconstruction period that follows the war. So there's a lot that's going to happen here. We've got the expansion of the United States, which we're really going to be focusing on here in chapter 11. And then we will lead into the causes of the Civil War in the next few chapters. All right, so let's get started with chapter 11. Let me share my screen. And notice that, right, there we go. So notice that we've got the title here, Imperial Ambitions. What do we mean by empire, imperial? We're talking about expanding into new territories, potentially new colonies. And then we've got our time period 1820 to 1848, because that's really going to be this expansion period. But even though this is not actually the official causes of the American Civil War, a lot of what happens here with expansion is tied to it over the slavery question about expanding slavery potentially into these new Western lands. So let's go ahead and get started here. And you can see that a lot of the territory, this is where things stand in green, where the United States was occupying the land after the Louisiana Purchase. We've got the new states here. You can see Missouri outlined. You've got Maine in there. You know that was part of the Missouri Compromise. But they had established at that time that any new state coming in above the line would automatically be a free state, and anything below the line would automatically be a slave state. But I want you to notice here, this area that's part of Mexico, Coahuila y Tejas, which is the state of Texas within the Mexican territory. They're going to win their independence from Spain here very shortly. But when this becomes annexed by the United States, look at how all of this is below that Missouri Compromise line. And that's going to cause some of the debate within the Senate. All right, and then you've got Great Britain that controls everything in pink. You've got Russia controlling Alaska here, but then also notice that Oregon here is kind of striped, because we're going to see that the United States and Great Britain are going to share Oregon, and that also will lead us into a few other problems. Okay, so if we look at the American South and we're looking at the social hierarchy within the South, we've talked about this a little bit more with the North when we talked about the emerging middle class during the industrial age. In the South, we've still got very little middle class. You've got the wealthy white Southern planter class. These would be the slaveholders. The very large slaveholders would have this really small percentage at the top of the population. When we say substantial proprietors, we're talking about these are people who would own significant land holdings, also own slaves, also be promoting or producing cotton, but not to the level that those planters would. The planter class would be like 100 or more slaves. Then when you have small freeholders, this means that they own land. They may or may not have slaves. If they do have slaves, it may only be 1 or 2. So these are not people who would have a large income, but still they're living, they own their own property. They're controlling their own economic situation. But then about 40% of the white population is here, not owning any land. They would be what we would call tenant farmers, where they would travel around and they would hire themselves out to work, sometimes for these small freeholders, sometimes overseeing some of the property for these other landholders in the upper classes. But then you have a line here. We would call this the color line. Whoops, let me go back. We would call this the color line between all of the various classes of the white population and then the Black population. So you have a small percentage of free Blacks living in the South. More would be living in these northern urban areas. And then you would also have the enslaved. And as we talked about, in some particular areas within that cotton producing belt, you would have more slave population than you would have white. And it also depended on the county. But when you tie all of this together and you begin to look at power or agency, agency is another word that historians often use for power. When you're looking at economic power, again, that's going to be centered here in this white landholding class. Political power, even though we have universal white male suffrage where these people can vote, the people who are being elected tend to come from this landholding group. So again, you've got this smaller part of the population that is controlling the economy and controlling the politics within the South. Now, we've already talked about that when you look at slaveholders, less than half, about 25% of the population in the South ever owned slaves. So they would fall in this category here. This would be about 25% of the population. And then this large slaveholding group would be less than 5%. So they're controlling the bulk of the economy and the money and the political power. So as we move forward, some of these small propertyless whites in the South began to see opportunity in the West. And as new states begin to form here in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, cotton is growing there, land is cheaper there. So you begin to see more of these people moving out to the West. You see more moving in to Tennessee and Kentucky and the new state of Missouri. But when we begin to look at this distribution of the slave population, it is still very clear where that cotton is being produced, right here through this swath in the Deep South. We've also got this concentration along the Mississippi River. All right, so what's going on internationally at the time, right? We're always thinking about contextualization. So with the United States in 1820, you have the era of good feelings. This is after the War of 1812 had ended in 1815, end of 1814, beginning of 1815. You've got the era of good feelings. This is before the corrupt bargain. Remember, that was in 1824. So things are relatively stable in the United States at this time. But in Mexico, Mexico had been a colony of Spain all the way back when Christopher Columbus arrives. All right, so think about Cortez and the conquistadors showing up in the 1400s, 1492, and in the early 1500s. So for hundreds of years, Mexico had been a colony of Spain. And in 1821, Mexico won its independence from Spain. So this was a time when you've got a brand new region that's now controlling itself politically, but has been a colony for so very long. Now think about the international respect or lack thereof that the United States had after winning its independence from Great Britain after just a shorter period of time. We know that the British didn't begin to colonize until the 1600s, so there's even another 100 years added on there that Mexico had been a colony of Spain. So most Europeans start to think, here's a possibility for expansion. Here's a possibility. We know that cotton is king in the United States. We know that there's a lot of cultivation of cotton that's making a good profit for them. Could this also happen in Mexico? So other countries began to think maybe there's opportunity here for expansion. And they don't really see Mexico as being a long-term independent country. Some Americans also begin to look at Mexico as an opportunity. So when we look at Mexican independence, there is a lot of turmoil. There is very little understanding of who's actually in charge in Mexico. The leadership there is going to be a little questionable for a period of time. Santa Anna will emerge as the military leader and the political leader for a period of time. But again, there's not a whole lot of stability. So this takes us back to this state within Mexico. We would call it Texas. All right. So originally this boundary for the Texas state. So just like the United States has different little regions, Mexico has different states as well. So this is the state of Texas, not the purple boundary. That's the boundary that the modern United States would have for Texas. but this is the area that would have been considered Texas during its Mexican time as part of Mexico. So this becomes an area, if cotton is growing here really well, this becomes an area where the Mexican government sees opportunity for economic growth. And they want to increase the population that's living here. They want more Mexicans to go and settle in that region. And they also want to attract Americans to move into that region. So as they start to formulate these opportunities, they are offering what are known as impresario land grants. And I would write that down. So the Mexican government is offering grants of land within Tejas or Texas to Americans who are willing to go and settle there. So think about the economic opportunity and what this will do to stabilize or help to stabilize that government. So Americans, including Stephen F. Austin, will get one of or some of these land grants. Stephen F. Austin and his father, they both are going to have these land grants. They get hundreds of thousands of acres, and they begin to resell it to Americans who want a new start, a fresh start of land of their own. Think about that 40% of the Southern white population that doesn't own any land. Here's their chance. So they begin to move out to Texas. They have followers that are coming with them, but Texas is part of Mexico. And so part of what they're also seeing is that this is something that Americans should do. They are viewing Mexico as inferior to the United States, and they see this as land that Americans need to settle and develop. So again, we're starting to get into this exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, where they view themselves as better politically, economically, and culturally than other groups in the region, and they begin to move out and begin to take control. So these land grants are provided by Mexico. In return for the land grant, here is what the Americans needed to agree to. They had to agree to Mexican citizenship because, again, what they would be producing in Tejas would be part of the Mexican export system. They also had to agree to worship as Roman Catholics, and they also had to agree to the Mexican Constitution, which banned slavery. So think about these American settlers moving into this remote area, because again, Tejas at that time, you had some natives who lived in the region, but you didn't have a large settled population. So many of these Americans are saying, sure, we'll be Mexican citizens. Sure, we'll worship as Roman Catholics, because again, how are they going to monitor that? Are they going to come into your house and look at how you're worshiping? Are they going to really monitor and be able to notice how many slaves you have in that region? So there's probably not going to be a lot of oversight because, again, remember, Mexico is a brand new independent nation. They're still trying to figure out their own organization. So this is not something that's enforced very well. And Stephen F. Austin and the others who move out to Texas are going to begin to settle there and really largely ignore many of these provisions in the deal that's been made for those impresario land grants. Antonio de Santa Anna becomes the leader of Mexico. He's like the president of Mexico, but he's also the military commander there. And when they finally kind of work things out and he is established as the leader, he is upset with the liberties that these Americans are taking in Texas, and he wants to enforce that. And so as he's wanting to enforce that, he's wanting to tax the region a little bit more. That's when the Americans living there are saying, wait a minute, we are not really interested in this. We feel like we have enough power. We feel like we have enough American backing that we can break away and form our own nation. And that's exactly what they do. So when Santa Anna comes in, tries to enforce some of those policies, tries to tax the region more, the Americans living in Texas break away and declare independence. Okay, so notice that this is happening here. This is the Texas War for Independence. Is this the United States declaring war on Mexico? No, it is not. This is the people living in Texas. They may be Americans, but these are the people of Texas breaking away and forming their own nation. So for a period of time, Texas is its own country, the Lone Star Republic. is what it was known as. Okay. Here is the flag of Texas. Notice it has one star because that state was its own country. And when you go to Texas and visit today, they're quite proud of this fact that they were a nation at one point. Santa Anna's not happy about this, and he brings in a force to go up against the Americans in Texas and to bring Texas back in to Mexico. So they're going to fight their own war between Texas and Mexico. And so this Texas Revolution, we know that Santa Anna comes in here eventually and faces resistance at the Alamo. This is where Colonel William Travis, and you've got Jim Bowie, if you've ever heard of a Bowie knife before, named for Jim Bowie. These are kind of frontier heroes. Davy Crockett was at the Alamo, and they were incredibly outnumbered, but they are going to hold off the forces of Santa Anna for a period of time. And that was pretty amazing that they were able to hold them off as long as they have. Now, you all know that I love to travel with my history friends, and we've been all over. This is one of the places that I've still not been to that I want to go and visit. So the Alamo, I am told, is actually really small. It was one of those old Catholic missions. So the building itself is one of the old Catholic missions. Think all the way back to when we talked about Spanish colonization in the region with the Aztecs. And we know that they set up the mission system. And we talked about that it went up the coast of California and also into these frontier areas about converting the natives living in the region to Catholicism. The Alamo was one of those old buildings. So when Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie and Colonel Travis, when they occupied the Alamo, this was the building that they were using. And so it's actually very tiny. So they held Santa Anna off for a period of time. Eventually, he overruns the Alamo and kills everyone who is there. So all of those Americans at the Alamo are killed by Santa Anna. It's not over. Okay, at this point, there are news stories that reach back to the United States. They're talking about the victims at the Alamo. They could have been taken prisoner, should there have been some sort of negotiation. We're in a time of war. But bottom line, there is a lot of support from the American frontier that comes in to reinforce the Texans in their fight for independence. And the leader, Sam Houston, so Stephen F. Austin colonizes Texas, and then Sam Houston is going to lead the Texans in their fight against Santa Anna. So Sam Houston gets a trap basically set up here at San Jacinto, lures Santa Anna to go in that direction. And here in April of 1836, so this is February and March, the disaster that happens here at the Alamo. A month and a half later, the Texans, led by Sam Houston and other frontier forces who have come to supplement him, are going to lure Santa Anna in to San Jacinto. They capture him and they force him to sign a treaty. So now think about that. Santa Anna was captured. The Texans are going to sit him down and they're going to say, here's our treaty, you've got to sign it. And he does. So once that's over with, Texas is now independent. And the terms that were decided on in this treaty at San Jacinto between Texas and Mexico are a little fuzzy about where the boundaries are. So keep that in mind because that becomes part of our story here in a few minutes. So Texas is now independent. Now, do they really want to be their own country? What are they growing in Texas? They're growing cotton. And if cotton is coming in from another country into the textile factories in the north, because again, what are those Texans wanting to do with their cotton? They want to sell it to the industrialized north. Well, if they're coming in from another country, isn't it subject to a tariff, an import tax? So that eats into their profits. What the people of Texas want is to be annexed by the United States. And that word annex means to bring in. So the annexation of Texas becomes a really, really controversial topic because if Texas comes in, Texas is a big place. If Texas comes in, and let's go back over here to this map, If Texas comes in, Missouri's up in this area, wouldn't all of this be below the Missouri Compromise line? So all of this would come in as slave states. And you could probably carve quite a few states out of this broad territory that's being added. So it becomes quite the debate over what to do about Texas. The Texans want to be annexed by the United States. The United States it's going to turn into a large fight, and it's going to be over power. Okay, so here is the Battle of the Alamo, Colonel Travis, and then there's the building itself, and they become heroes. So this, this famous saying, "Remember the Alamo," it's like building on the emotional priorities of protecting their land and the sympathies for these people who were very brave and held off Santa Anna for a period of time. So here is the surrender. Santa Anna is going to be signing that treaty that grants Texas its independence. And the first president of Texas is Sam Houston, the guy who had led Santa Anna into the trap at San Jacinto and had secured independence for Texas. He's the one who's trying to get annexation from the United States. But that's where we're going to see this dispute. All right, so look at this advertisement. This is from January of 1838. And it's from Boston. Faneuil Hall is one of the historic meeting places in historic Boston. And look what it's saying, anti-Texas meeting. What state is Boston from? Massachusetts. That is correct. That's going to be our textile leading state there in textiles. But look what it says. A proposition has been made and will soon come up for consideration in the United States to annex Texas to the Union. Then skip down here, look what it says. It is large enough to make 9 or 10 states as large as Massachusetts. It was, under Mexico, a free territory. The freebooters have made it a slave territory. The design is to annex it with its load of infamy and oppression to the Union. The immediate result may be a war with Mexico. The ultimate result will be some 18 or 20 more slaveholders in the Senate of the United States, because every state gets 2 senators, right? So you're adding, if you get 9 or 10 states carved out of this Texas territory, then you're going to have double that number added to the Senate. Think about what that does to the balance of power. A still large number in the House of Representatives, and the balance of power in the hands of the South. And if, when in the minority in Congress, slaveholders browbeat the North, demand the passage of gag laws, we've already talked about the gag rule, trample the rights of the petition, and threaten in defiance of the general government to hang every man caught at the South who dares to speak against their domestic institutions, which is code for slavery, what limits shall be set to their intolerant demands and high-handed usurpations when they are in the majority? So again, they're inviting people to come and voice their opinions about opposing Texas annexation. So the situation of expanding the border of the United States becomes about slavery's expansion and what that does to the political balance of power. So this is a really controversial issue. All right, so let's look at slavery a little more closely. In the slavery in the United States, we know that the international slave trade has ended, but you've got the domestic slave trade. And when you look at the different groups of Africans African Americans in the United States who are enslaved, you had previously had pretty distinct cultures when there was more international influence. But it's all kind of blended together to become a unique culture within the United States. And one of those that's most unique, and it's familiar here in a portion of our state along coastal Georgia and into coastal Carolina, is called the Gullah Geechee culture. And this takes the language, the West African language, blends elements of that West African language groups into American language, and it becomes a very unique sound. You still have pockets of Gullah speakers in the Deep South, in the coastal area. Off of coastal Georgia, there's a particular island called Sapelo Island, and I encourage you to look up Sapelo Island. It was one of the areas where Gullah speakers remained. And it was almost an isolated community that was pretty much undisturbed for a long period of time. And anthropologists have gone to study, and sociologists have gone to study Sapelo Island and the language itself that's been preserved there. Notice this woman down here who is making a sweetgrass basket. If you've ever been to Charleston, it's all over. So this method of taking these stalks of sweetgrass that have been dried and weaving them into these baskets, it's an art. And that's passed down through the Gullah culture as well. So these are just some of the phrases that you can look at the English word and then the Gullah word, and it's blending all of this together. These are in downtown Charleston. There is probably one of the best museums I've ever been to. And this is in the old part of Charleston. And it's the old slave mart. And so to have this museum, the Slave Mart Museum, in this particular space that used to be an auction house for enslaved Africans right there on the coast, part of the international slave trade, and then in the domestic slave trade as well, is quite powerful. And we were hosting, I work with a couple of professors at Georgia State, and we host a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute for teachers. And so I help to coordinate and bring the teachers in, and then we have lessons. We study constitutional history, and we look at what slavery means in the Constitution. And we take a 4-day field trip. The teachers are usually with us for 2 weeks every summer. And then we take a 4-day field trip and we go to Charleston. And one of the places that we go and visit is this one, the old slave mart in downtown Charleston. And when we took the teachers there this last time, we had the most fantastic tour guide ever. And he wanted to take us out and show us another part of the museum. And it's actually just a parking lot. And he said, when you go out here, this today is a parking lot, but notice that there are brick walls that line both sides of this parking lot, and then the entrance is on the back. He said there used to be a brick wall across the back too. And he said that this was actually the place where enslaved people who were coming up to be sold were housed, not really housed because they weren't there permanently, but they were held until their lot came up on the auction block inside the mart. And he wanted to show us that space, that today is just it's a parking lot. But he said, when you look at these bricks, all right, so all of downtown Charleston, look at all these old bricks here on these buildings. There's bricks over here, all through Charleston. You've got these old buildings, and they're brick primarily. And he said, to make a brick by hand is really an art. You know, it's a craft to make sure you've got to have the bricks that are all the same size and the same exact shape, because if you get up the wall and they're different shapes, then it's not going to be level at the top. So he said it takes a lot of practice to take clay and form it into a perfectly sized brick that's uniform for all bricks. And he said that these walls out here in this parking lot were made by enslaved labor, and the bricks that were used, because again, this was the slave mart, it didn't need to be a fancy building. He said the bricks that were made here were the practice bricks that the young enslaved men were learning on. And so they probably weren't shaped perfectly, and they weren't perfectly smooth, and they might have had some errors in it. So the walls kind of jagged across the top. And he said, I want you to look at these bricks, and you will see the fingerprints of the enslaved people who made those bricks. And we were kind of not really sure what he was talking about, but when we went out there, that entire parking lot, all the way up and down both sides, every one of those bricks, you could see the fingerprints in those bricks. And I can't tell you how powerful that was to see in this space these bricks that had the fingerprints of the enslaved people who made those bricks, making basically a pin that would hold people, humans, families, men, women, children, who were about to be sold, potentially splitting up their families to be sent somewhere else. For the rest of our time in Charleston, we started looking at every brick wall in that city, and the handprints, the fingerprints of slavery are still there in 2020, all over that town. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay. Here are some bricks. Again, look how jagged they are. They're not perfect, but there's a fingerprint. There's a fingerprint. There's a fingerprint. I've got my finger on one. So you can feel literally the history in this town. So again, I've never looked at it the same way. Okay, when I went to Charleston and you see all these beautiful old homes, now what I'm seeing is the slave labor who built those homes. It's quite a different experience. All right, here are some other terms related to Gullah. I've got a couple of really good books if you're interested in the Gullah culture that are written by people who are Gullah from Sapelo Island, and they tell their background, their story, and it's really fascinating. So if you're interested, I've got one of those books that I can recommend to you. All right, so as we are continuing to look at this idea of expansion into the West, the term that we use to relate to this expansion is manifest destiny. And you really, really need to know this term and understand what it's talking about here in the 1840s. So manifest destiny, if something is manifest, all right, and then destiny is like God is controlling it, okay? So manifest means it's meant to be. Manifest is it's ours, your destiny. That's tying God into it as well. So John O'Sullivan, who was a newspaper writer, made up this or used this phrase, and it just caught on. Look what he had to say. Our manifest destiny is to overspread the continent allotted by providence. Providence is another word for what? Providence is another word for God, okay? Our manifest destiny is to overspread the continent allotted by God or providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. By the 1840s, we have a large number of immigrants moving into the United States. Okay, think about again, what's causing this rise in the immigrant population at that time. You've got the Irish potato famine, you've got the political unrest in Germany. That's bringing two of the largest European groups into the United States. We've got this expansion for industry in the North. We've got the expansion of cotton culture in the South. And what John O'Sullivan is saying is that God wants the United States to control all of this territory. It was meant to be. It is meant for this large growing population to cultivate this land and to bring it into the United States. Okay, now again, think back to when we talked about the city upon a hill analogy. Didn't we say that the Puritans believed if they were the shining example and they were successful in planting their colony there at Massachusetts Bay, that clearly God favored them to succeed? Then think through the odds of winning the American Revolution. No one have given the Americans any odds of winning, but they did. So maybe God had his hand in that. Then the War of 1812. And so now they're adding to that same type of thought process that it's destiny. Everything has worked out along the way for the United States to be independent, to maintain its territory and to expand. And so now it's time to expand again. So that's what we mean by this phrase, manifest destiny. You're going to see a lot of paintings that come out of this time period as well, showing just this glorification of moving west, the westward expansion, and the bringing of progress to an area that is uncivilized and taming the West and all of the opportunity that's there, right? So notice that we've got this family, this frontiersman, they're pointing to the West, and this is unsettled territory, and they're headed out. All right, this is a painting that is very important, related to the idea of manifest destiny. So I would know this painting. There are a few pieces of art that are used on the AP exam. This is one of them. John Gast and his painting is called American Progress. Think about the name, American Progress. And so when you look at this painting to start with, the focal point would certainly be this woman here. Doesn't she look almost angelic? Somewhat, but she's actually Lady Liberty. And we know that because she's got this star, right? This star on her forehead is indicating that she's Lady Liberty. And she is representing freedom. But notice you've got this religious imagery that's tied with how she's depicted. Think about manifest destiny. Isn't this idea of God and the religious foundation part of that? Yes. And so here she is. She's headed to the west. She's got with her this book, and this book is a school book. So think about Horace Mann and public education that's being promoted during the Reform era. And then she's also bringing a telegraph wire. We talked about telegraph with instant communication. And then I also want you to notice the lighting. So you've got the really bright sun that's illuminating. Look, we've got a suspension bridge now here. This is representing New York and Manhattan. And you've got all of the steamships. You've got the trains now. You've got telegraph wires. You have the stagecoaches. You have these farmers here. These would be representing miners who are headed out. There's the Pony Express. And then as they get farther out here, ahead of Lady Liberty, it's really dark and cloudy. And it's very primitive. You've got the buffalo roaming free. You've got the natives that are running away. You've got the tribal dances that are here. And you've got the covered wagons that are headed out on the Oregon Trail. So John Gast's American Progress, the imagery here is talking about that this is a positive thing. We're bringing progress to an untamed, uncivilized area, right? So these mountains would be representing the Rocky Mountains, and then you've got the coast over here, and it's just dark and desolate. So think about all of the imagery that's going on here related to the American movement west. There are two areas in particular that become destinations for large numbers of settlers. One will be the Oregon Territory. And remember, we said that Great Britain and the United States are going to share Oregon, because up until this point, how many people lived out here? How many Europeans lived out here? Americans lived out here? Hardly any. But now that we're beginning to trade and open up a little bit of trade with China, open up a little bit of trade with the Orient, okay? This is also at about the same time that we're going to start to get into the opening of Tokyo Bay with Matthew Perry and the American fleet that shows up in the Orient. And so some of these entrepreneurs in the East are looking at the really, really great harbors that are in the Puget Sound and how that could be a place if we have railroads that are connecting the East Coast to the West Coast, could we now open up more American trade with the Orient? We've got to have a coastline there. So that's what's going to suddenly make this a very important area. So the original boundary of Oregon would be way up here. And if we were looking at the line of latitude, this would be the 5440 line of latitude. You know, on the globe, how you've got the lines of longitude and latitude. 5440 would be this line right here, and that's going to become important in just a second. So you've got businesses that are setting up here. You've got the Hudson Bay Company, the British company that's getting into the fur trade here in Oregon, and they're kind of establishing themselves. And then you've got more Americans that are looking into this. And then there's also this missionary movement. American missionaries are moving into Oregon as well and setting up farms, more so in the Willamette Valley down here in the southern part of the Columbia River, where the British are kind of establishing themselves a little bit farther to the north. But this becomes kind of an area where both groups, the United States and Great Britain, are thinking, maybe we should get control of this, fully for our country. So this is going to be the pathway that American settlers are going to use out to the west. You've got the Mormon Trail. We know about that coming from Nauvoo, Illinois, where Brigham Young takes the Mormons to settle here near Salt Lake City. And then the Oregon Trail. All of these trails are leaving from Independence, Missouri. That's kind of the last point where American boundaries would be a considerable town where you can stock up on supplies. So if you were leaving your home in Georgia, Kentucky, Virginia, Pennsylvania, wherever, and you were going to move out to the west, you would get yourself here to Independence, Missouri, stay there for a little bit of time, stock up on supplies, and then time your trip out to the Pacific coast to not get stuck in the Rocky Mountains during the winter. So you would probably leave at the first thaw of the spring. So usually late March, early April is when you would set out from Independence, Missouri. The Oregon Trail is going to follow this pathway. And then you also have a branch of people who leave the Oregon Trail and head out to California and to Monterey and San Francisco. So these are our destinations where people are headed. Hundreds of thousands of people will take this pathway over about a decade from Independence, Missouri out to Oregon and to California. You can actually still see the wagon train ruts. Now, when you were in elementary school or middle school, did you play that little game Oregon Trail on the computer where you pick out your supplies and you go along the way and then this random stuff happens to you, like a tornado hits or something, and you lose some supplies and all of the situations that come up? Well, that's what they're talking about here, is this pathway that these frontier settlers, the wagon trains that are headed out there. Very, very difficult trip. You know, you've got women, you've got children, they're bringing their cattle with them to try to set up these ranches along the way when they get to Oregon. So things are difficult on the Oregon Trail. Look at these pathways. You can still see the ruts in the ground today. This is from today. These are ruts going all the way back to the days of the Oregon Trail in the early 1800s. So they were incredibly deep. And the land just has not recovered from the hundreds of thousands of settlers who went, and the wagon trains, the thousands and thousands of wagon trains that followed this exact same path over the land. All right. Also, you've got Mexico that's kind of digging their heels in here, wanting to protect their territory, because the United States is also kind of looking at California coastline as being maybe a possibility. And so we had the mission system that was already there, as we've talked about before. And so you can see all of these little remote outposts of Catholic missions that are in the region. So those will become important as well. And then in between, you have these native groups that have really adopted the horse for their culture. The Lakota Sioux and the Comanche they rely on the buffalo hunt for all parts of their lives. When they would kill the buffalo, they would have the meat, they would use the hide and skins for teepee and clothing and blankets and leather goods and all of these things. They would use the bones to create tools. Every part of that buffalo was used by the tribes. Nothing was left to waste. But as the Americans began to come in further and further into their territory, they began to set up these trade operations, because Europeans began to really covet the hides of these buffalo, and they would make coats, buffalo coats out of them. And so trade deals began to develop, where the Lakota Sioux and the Comanche would hunt the buffalo, and then in return, they would be getting goods from the Americans and the Europeans. Look at this image. This is from Dodge City in Kansas. This is from a little bit later, after this has all been going on, but this is a hide yard. This is 40,000 buffalo hides that are drying out before they would then be sent to Europe for profit. But the hides were skinned and the meat was left behind. And what they ended up doing was they overhunted before the buffalo could naturally reproduce and sustain their population. So the natives who were engaged in this buffalo hunt with the Americans ended up destroying their own way of life in many ways. Now, I'm not saying that all of them were engaged in these trade deals, but there was an enormous amount of waste that goes on, and not everything was used. The meat would just lay rotting in the wild, and then the hides would be brought into hide yards like this. So to give you an idea of scale, look at this man sitting over here on top of these 40,000 hides. All right, 1844 becomes the next election year, And you'll remember William Henry Harrison. We've already talked about him. He was president for like 30 something days. And then John Tyler comes in as the Whig president. But John Tyler didn't necessarily agree with Whig policies. One in particular that he was opposed to was the American system. He was opposed to the taxes. He was opposed to federal government funding for internal improvements. He was opposed to all of that. And so the Whigs are like, I'm not so sure that this is our guy. So look who the Whigs bring back. They bring back our good buddy, Henry Clay. So this is the third time that Henry Clay is going to be running for president. The Democrats, even though Tyler is acting like a Democrat, they don't actually trust him, which they probably have a point there. So the Democrats are going to go with James K. Polk. He is from Tennessee. Who was the founder of the Democratic Party? Yes, that was Andrew Jackson. Where was Andrew Jackson from? He was from Tennessee. And Andrew Jackson's nickname was Old Hickory. That was his nickname. You know, he was this, you know, big, strong military commander and strong as a hickory tree. Okay, so he was known as Old Hickory. Well, they nicknamed James K. Polk Young Hickory because he was kind of a protege of Andrew Jackson. And so the Democrats bring him in as their candidate because he's going to kind of bring back this idea of Andrew Jackson and the foundations of that party. And Henry Clay is going to run again for the Whigs. Well, the main issue that's going to be the issue that is really of importance during this election is, what are we going to do about the annexation of Texas? What are we going to do about that? Because if you bring Texas in as a slave state, then that's going to shift that balance of power. So again, we've got this regional divide going on at the same time that we have the Whigs and the Democrats competing in this election. So James K. Polk is actually going to say, if you make me president, not only will I annex Texas, because that's kind of scary for people because they know that that's going to come in as slave states. He says, if you bring me in as Texas, I'm also going to annex Oregon. I'm going to bring in all of Oregon, 54-40 or fight, right? All of this territory is going to be brought in as well. So if you think about what James K. Polk is proposing, you would bring in Texas that you know is going to become a slave state, but you're also going to bring in Oregon. And this coastline in Oregon would benefit the northern states, who would then have port cities to be able to send their manufactured goods to the Orient. So he's kind of being strategic here, bringing in support from the South and bringing in support from the North, saying, I'm going to annex both. Think about manifest destiny. We would now expand from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast for the United States. So in a very close election, Polk wins and Clay loses again, right? So think about why James K. Polk is going to get all these votes. Polk is going to get all these votes here in the Deep South because what's he saying he's going to do? He's going to annex Texas. He's also getting some votes here in the North, Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, because he's saying he's going to be bringing in Oregon. People in the West, Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, they want to bring in Oregon. Again, think about that Oregon Trail, that connection from the different places. Henry Clay is going to carry his home state of Kentucky. He's going to carry this area in Massachusetts, which again, that ties back to the American system that we know he supports. So in the electoral vote, you know, Polk wins. So suddenly James K. Polk is your new president. He's going to annex Texas. But when he annexes Texas under the terms of the agreement that had originally been signed during the Mexican War with Texas, that said that the Rio Grande River was the boundary. Well, now remember that Mexico was kind of in flux in terms of who the political leader was. And so the new leaders who come into power in Mexico are saying, he signed that under duress. That doesn't really apply to us anymore. So they are going to disavow that treaty and the boundary that was set. And this is going to lead us into a war with Mexico. And really, Polk didn't mind that because he looks at Mexico as a fairly weak power. And he believes that not only can you resolve the Texas issue, But what if we also were able to gain control of the rest of northern Mexico, which would include California? That's going to give us all of that coastline. So James K. Polk, here he annexes Texas very soon after taking office. And here is where we've got the disputed issue. All right, so this is the boundary in yellow of what Mexico believes is Texas. Everything in yellow and green is what Texas believes is Texas. And so this disputed territory right here, all right, so this line right here is the Rio Grande River. This line right here is the Nueces River. And so the land in between is claimed by both countries. All right, now let's think about what's happening here. Polk is wanting to annex Texas. He also is worried that if we don't annex Texas, there is already rumbling that Great Britain might annex Texas for itself. Because hasn't Great Britain been importing American cotton from the Northeast? From the South. Haven't they been importing cotton from the American South? Yes, that's our largest export. What if they had their own cotton producing territory as a colony? That's going to help Great Britain. So if they annex Texas, then Texas doesn't have to worry about being annexed by the United States. There's also rumblings that Great Britain might have designs on taking possession of Cuba. So if that were to happen and Great Britain got Cuba, which many people in the American South were looking towards Cuba to get control of that area for the sugarcane production to make more money, and Great Britain had Oregon and they got Texas, Polk is worried about what that does to the power of Great Britain. So James K. Polk wants to acquire Texas for the United States, but he wants it to be started. He knows this is probably going to go to war, but he wants Mexico to start the war because that's going to be a hard sell to go and be the aggressor. Every time, think about our foreign policy. What has George Washington established in the Neutrality Proclamation? United States going to stay out of these international affairs. What have we established in the Monroe Doctrine? United States going to stay out of these international affairs unless American interests are endangered. Isn't that why we started fighting in the War of 1812, impressment of sailors? Isn't that why we started fighting in the American Revolution with the issues of the abuse by the British? So here we need, or Polk needs, Mexico to start the war. He's going to get more support for it that way because it goes against this idea of neutrality. All right, so he's going to send Zachary Taylor, which we'll get into in a minute, to go camp out here between the rivers. In the meantime, this military commander, John C. Fremont, he's going to send to California because he knows that if war comes to Mexico, he wants to already have the United States Navy positioned in California off the coast to be able to then come in and take control of that territory. So to get there, you got to go all the way around South America. So that's going to take some time. So he goes ahead and he sends John C. Fremont out to California. Well, when he gets there, Fremont sees this beautiful, expansive land with all kinds of opportunity. And he also has a gift of writing. So John C. Fremont is a glorious writer. He writes these beautiful accounts of the images that he is seeing and the opportunities that are there. And he sends these stories back to the east. And people are like, oh, California, we need to move out there. That sounds like a great place. All right, so while Fremont is in California, Zachary Taylor comes and camps out here between the rivers. So here is the Rio Grande River. This is the border claimed by the United States. Mexico believes that this is their territory. So when Zachary Taylor comes and camps out here between the rivers, so here he's got his military personnel, and James K. Polk says, you just go camp out there. You don't fight anybody. You just go and pitch a tent and just go camp there. All right, look what happens. So when Zachary Taylor camps here, under the perspective of the United States, this is fully within their rights. Texas is now a state. So this is It's okay to protect that border with the Rio Grande. But if you're in Mexico, Mexico is viewing this as an invasion of Mexican territory because everything in green is claimed by Mexico. So when Zachary Taylor is camped out right here along the river, Mexico views that as an invasion, and they cross the river and attack. That's exactly what James K. Polk needed. So what Polk says, he gets his war declaration. Do I have the war declaration? Well, anyway, he gets the war declaration, and he talks about American blood has been spilt on American land. We must defend our land, which is justified, right? Even with the Monroe Doctrine and the Neutrality Proclamation and farewell address and everything else from George Washington, that's justified when American lives have been killed on American soil by a foreign power. And so the war declaration is received. However, there is question by a small faction of Whigs, because remember, what party is James K. Polk from? He's a Democrat. Abraham Lincoln is what we would call a freshman member of the House of Representatives. By freshman, we mean it's his first year in 1847. So this is the first time that Abraham Lincoln enters our story. And Abraham Lincoln from Illinois, nobody's ever heard of him outside of his own little town of Springfield, Illinois. He's there in the House of Representatives, and they're voting on this war declaration. And Lincoln stands up and demands to know the exact spot where American blood was shed. He's kind of questioning how all of this goes down, right? Was this some sort of a, staged event that would justify war that Polk would want? So as a Whig, Lincoln's demand here becomes known as the spot resolution. And I would write that down because this is the first time that we see Lincoln kind of making national ripples here, where he's demanding to know where the blood was actually shed. And was this something that is justified? Should we really be going to war? He wasn't terribly supportive of this Mexican-American War, as it was called. The spot resolution was basically ignored because, again, Abraham Lincoln was not very well known. But I think it gives us an indication in the leaning that Abraham Lincoln will have here in the future. All right, so the war with Mexico is going to last for a year or two. So immediately we've got John C. Fremont, who comes into California here, going to get control very quickly of this whole area. The United States quickly gets control of this border area with Texas, and also comes in here along the Gulf of Mexico and takes control of Mexico City. So by the time of the surrender of Mexico, all of this is now in the possession of the United States. The United States has used its military to secure everything in California east, all of Mexico through Mexico City, all the way down to Central America. Every bit of it is in the possession of the United States. Okay, so this was an overwhelming victory. Now, think about the popularity of this war. This war is in the late 1840s. When was the last time the United States was at war? War of 1812. So that was a good 25 to 30 years ago. So all of those people who had fought in the War of 1812, it kind of becomes, this nostalgia. You're sitting around at family gatherings. Well, back when I was in the war, and it's this point of pride in their families that they've got these war heroes. So this next generation, these children, or people who were children or not even yet born at the time of the War of 1812, had heard about the heroism of their family members, their ancestors in the War of 1812, and they kind of want to carry on that tradition. So this becomes a very popular war here in the 1840s. We also see that this is about 15 to 20 years before we get into the Civil War, 15 years or so before we get into the Civil War in the United States. And a lot of the commanders in the Civil War are going to get their first taste of war and their experience in war in this Mexican-American War. Ulysses S. Grant was part of this. Robert E. Lee, all of these guys were part of the Mexican-American War. So that's also another reason why it's important. Okay, the Bear Flag Republic. This was an area in Northern California that during the course of the Mexican-American War seceded from Mexico and were temporarily kind of their own area as well, and will ultimately be annexed by the United States. So when we talk about the California Republic, look again, it's got that one star. So the Bear Flag Republic, you've got California, part of it secedes from Mexico, becomes independent, and then is annexed by the United States. So keep this all straight. This is where I find that kids get all of this kind of mushed up together. There are 3 different wars that we've talked about in this one chapter. Mexico won its war for independence from Spain. Was the United States part of this? No, the United States was not part of this. This was Mexico versus Spain. Mexico wins. Suddenly they have independence. Then later on, Texas fights a war against Mexico, right? Because Texas becomes the Lone Star Republic. The Texas Revolution, or the Texas War for Independence. Is the United States part of this war? No. Are there Americans who fight in the Texas War for Independence? Yes. But the United States government is not part of this war. The United States military is not part of this war. It is Texas, which was its own country at the time, versus Mexico. Texas wins. Then, after Polk wins the election in 1844, Texas is annexed, which they had been wanting ever since the end of the Texas War for Independence. They'd been wanting that. And then the third war is the United States war with Mexico over the boundary. So this is after Texas is annexed. It's part of the United States, but there's a dispute of where the boundary is located. All right, now we never really kind of cleared up what happened with Oregon. When this happens, this annexation of Texas by the United States, we know that when Polk was campaigning, he said, you elect me, I'm going to bring in Oregon and I'm going to bring in Texas. Well, Great Britain is probably not going to turn over Oregon at this point without a fight. And we also know that this boundary with Texas is probably not going to be resolved without a fight. So Polk has a decision to make. If he goes and honors his campaign pledge of bringing in Oregon and Texas, he's probably going to have to fight 2 wars. Who would you prefer? And that's not a good idea at any point, to fight 2 different wars with 2 different countries at the same time. So if you had to choose, would you want to fight Great Britain a 3rd time or fight Mexico, a brand new nation that's not well established? You would much prefer to fight Mexico. So he takes his chances here by sending Zachary Taylor down. But what he does in Oregon is he sends a negotiator, and he actually negotiates with the British. Let me go back to this map here of Oregon. He negotiates with the British to compromise and say, okay, if all of this is Oregon territory, let's split it in half and avoid a war. And honestly, Great Britain doesn't want to fight the United States a 3rd time either. Yes, they would like Oregon, but this is not territory that's going to be worth them fighting over again. So they agree to split it in half. The northern part of this becomes British territory, and the southern part of this becomes the state of Oregon in the United States. So he negotiates the settlement here rather than claiming and taking the whole thing. Because remember, he campaigned on 54-40 or fight, which was all the way up here. But then he's got to kind of be practical about this. We're not going to fight a war with 2 countries at the same time. So he negotiates with the British, gets Oregon, splits it with the British formally. Now we have no claim to this part. They have no claim to that part. The boundary is resolved, but then fights the war with Mexico. Okay, so hopefully that clears Manifest Destiny up and the expansion into the West. We talked a little bit about slave society as well. And we will pick up in chapter 12 with the lead up to the war, the Civil War and the war itself. So until next time, keep reading and go make history.